This episode is being brought to you by my good friends over at McLaren & Associates. McLaren & Associates is the premier sell-side advisory firm for dental practice owners seeking a DSO affiliation or private equity partnership. Their team is comprised of experienced sell-side advisors whose sole focus is to educate practice owners regarding their EBITDA and practice value, then create a highly competitive environment among multiple DSO buyers to create multiple options to maximize your outcome from the sale. If you're interested in learning more about DSO transactions and the options available in today's marketplace, reach out to Brannon Moncrief at McLaren & Associates at 512-660-8505 or go to dentaltransitions.com. That's 512-660-8505 or go to dentaltransitions.com. This is one of the biggest decisions in a practice owner's journey, so make sure you're working with the best. McLaren & Associates.
The Dentalpreneur Podcast. Okay, doctor, it's time to put down that handpiece. You're listening to the show dedicated to helping dentists get their lives back. It's time to decrease your stress, increase your profitability, and regain your passion. Now introducing your host, Dr. Mark Costas.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Dentalpreneur Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Mark Costas. What's up, friends? I hope you're doing great out there today. I'm really excited for this interview today. I've been looking at my schedule and with a lot of anticipation about this guest who I've had on this podcast before, and we've had lots of great interactions and conversations over the years about his line of work. Let's welcome Brannon Moncrief to the podcast today. Brannon has over 20 years of dental industry experience as a banker, broker, and sell-side advisor. His firm, McLaren & Associates, specializes in providing sell-side advisory to dentists and specialists seeking DSO affiliation or private equity partner. Welcome to the podcast, Brannon. How you doing, buddy?
Good, Mark. Great to see you.
Great to see you as well. So you hail from, where are we zooming in from today?
I am based in Austin, Texas.
That's right. One of my favorite areas of the world, one of my favorite cities of the world. Hey man, there's so much to talk about. Last time I saw you was June at the Dental Success Summit. You've been such a great supporter of all things dental success for years and years now, and the podcast as well. So thank you in advance for all of that. Tell me about what you're seeing in the marketplace nowadays, as far as DSOs, multiples, the number of docs that are selling, their ages, all of those things are topics that we could talk about for hours.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been an interesting year with a lot of movement, a lot of changes in the marketplace. So just talking about from a sell side activity standpoint, I think more sellers in the market than we've ever seen. And the age of those sellers has declined pretty substantially over the past few years. Prior to a couple of years ago, our average client was around, I'd say between 55 and 60 years old. But now we're seeing a lot of younger, very successful practice owners in their late 30s to mid 40s go to market. So that's been an interesting change. But I think the amount of sell side activity that we're seeing, the reason that it's increased is, obviously the consolidation of the dental industry has been picking up momentum over the past few years. And the word is out that private equity loves our industry and multiples are strong. There's a lot of players on the buy side, a lot of options available. And I think also from the standpoint of my business, practice owners are starting to realize that they need proper representation. They need to build a team. They need to have a sell-side advisor on their side. They need to create optionality and leverage if they're going to go to market. So the days of responding to those unsolicited offers without shopping around, without getting a feel for, the different deal structures, the different options that are available, those days are kind of gone. So most doctors are wise to the fact that they need somebody like us at the table to provide optionality, to create leverage, and to help them find the right DSO, the right private equity firm for their practice, and maximize their economic outcome. From a buy side perspective, I mean, the activity level's been high, but I will say that because of the fact that the capital markets have been tight over the past year and with elevated interest rates, some DSOs are on pause. They don't have capital, or their cost of capital is so high that they're kind of on their heels rather than on their toes from a bidding perspective. So they're not being as aggressive pursuing opportunities, or they're not bidding as high as they were a year or two ago. So we've probably got, a quarter of the DSOs on the sidelines right now, whether that means they don't have capital or they're kind of over their skis operationally. A lot of DSOs acquired practices at a crazy clip coming out of COVID, and they were acquiring EBITDA, acquiring offices as fast as they possibly could. And now they've got to kind of catch their breath and allow their infrastructure to catch up to their growth so that they can properly integrate and operate these practices long term. Now, when we've got a quarter of the marketplace, on hold, not buying practices, that void has been filled by smaller, more agile, younger DSOs that have taken on PE money, over the past couple of years and still have plenty of runway from a cash perspective, from an equity perspective, and from a bank, leverage availability perspective. So those emerging DSOs, the 20 to 50 location DSOs have kind of stepped up to fill that void that some of the legacy DSOs have left by being on the sidelines.
Now, do you think that some of the legacy DSOs that are a little bit bloated, or maybe were a little bit crazy about acquisitions not too long ago, do you think that they are on the sidelines, or they are suffering from acquiring less than ideal assets, or is it just a nature of not being able to get affordable capital?
It's a great question. I think it's a combination, and it's a mixed bag from DSO to DSO. Okay. No doubt there were DSOs out there that were being, I think, overly aggressive in buying less than ideal assets. Over the past few years, they were really trying to buy everything that came across their desk. And as a result of that, some of those practices have moved backwards, post-affiliation, combined with increased cost of capital. That makes banks nervous. It makes private equity investors nervous. So there's definitely been a change in the marketplace, not just with those DSOs that didn't have the proper discipline as to what they were buying and maybe overpaying for those, assets that weren't ideal, but all DSOs are being more mindful of evaluating the opportunities that are coming across their desk, right? Those deals that had murky financials, that had hair on them, that had maybe founders that wanted to exit within a year or two post-affiliation, those deals are harder to get done and are trading for lower multiples. But the A+ quality deals out there where the doctor, has some runway 3 to 5 years, prior to exiting the business, has a strong EBITDA margin, still has meat on the bone, potential for growth, and are located in good geographies, those practices are still trading for peak multiples. Gotcha.
And I'm going to go into what those ranges are here in a second, but I would, you alluded to the fact that the most attractive acquiring target or acquisition target is a doc that has a little bit of runway. What are we looking at as far as like the ideal age, the ideal demographic? You alluded to that a little bit too. The ideal number of providers, the ideal physical characteristics of a building that a practice is kind of located in. What are you seeing? I mean, I know that you could look at a client as, a sell side advisor and go, you probably need to expand, or you need another provider potentially. You're not going to get the multiple that maybe somebody like in Austin, Texas, or a prime market would get. So what are they looking for? What is the ideal target right now as you see it?
In an ideal world, DSOs are looking for, doctors that have at least 3 to 5 years before they look to exit the business. So I would say DSO version 1.0 required doctors stick around 2 or 3 years post-affiliation, but DSOs have gotten wise to the fact that doctor turnover, in particular founder turnover, is their Achilles heel. So they want the doctors to be tethered to the business for a longer period of time, but that comes with more autonomy than DSO version 1.0 offered.
Right.
DSO version 1.0 wanted you there for 2 or 3 years post-affiliation, but you had to work a certain number of days a week or a certain number of days a year chairside. You had to produce at a certain clip. That's no longer really the case. A lot of our clients look to sell their business to a DSO and step away chairside within 1 to 2 years post-affiliation. They're still going to play some sort of leadership or management role in the business post-affiliation after they step away chairside, but they're not required to work chairside or produce, at a certain pace post-affiliation. So that's been a marked change. Ideally, DSOs would prefer that you have at least a couple of providers. We still sell a lot of single doc practices, but in an ideal world, they would like to reduce key man risk. The easiest way to reduce key man risk is to spread the production out among multiple providers. So we see the highest multiples for practices owned by doctors in their 40s and 50s, where production has been spread out among multiple providers. Maybe there's 2, 3, 4 associates. You're likely going to see more demand and a higher multiple in that type of opportunity. When it comes to, facility, the DSO wants the practice to have at least 2 providers at some point in time. So you really need 5 ops minimum, ideally 8 plus, to, attract the attention of a wide audience of buyers. Geographically speaking, the consolidation is now happening across the country. Texas is obviously a hot market. Arizona's hot. The Southeast has been, a very, very hot market for quite some time. Now we're starting to see more and more consolidation in New England. The Midwest has kind of lit back up again. And then the consolidation is starting on the West Coast. We recently established a San Diego office because we started seeing more and more activity along the West Coast. The West Coast has been hard to ignore for DSOs, even though it's not an ideal, business environment from a tax perspective, from a regulatory oversight perspective. 20% of the dentists in the country are on the West Coast. And as these other markets have gotten somewhat saturated, from a DSO perspective, DSOs they're looking for blue sky. They're looking for open pastures, and the West Coast is wide open. So we're starting to see a lot of attention out that way.
Very interesting. Very interesting. So if you are a doctor that has successfully kind of transitioned to the CEO role, and you have, a facility, like you said, maybe 8 operatories, 2 to 3 full-time doctors in there, you spend 100% of your time managing the office or small group of offices, and you don't generate any of your income from clinical dentistry anymore. So you're a little bit of a hybrid when the DSOs are purchasing you, because typically the seller is one of the primary clinical providers. So if this is the case, are these practices still attractive to DSOs or private equity firms? And if so, if the typical formula is you put them in there and then they make, associate pay, they take some chips off the table. They get 50 to 70% money in the first bite. And then there's retained equity and you reinvest it into the mothership and maybe you have a second bite of the apple in 3 to 5 years. And we'll talk about those terms, et cetera. But if they're not making a typical clinical salary, how are they usually compensated as the CEO?
The short answer is it depends. So DSOs love those type of practices, and that's certainly a growing trend, right? We've got a lot of young entrepreneurial clients who have removed themselves from the chair, either partially or fully, and they focus their time on managing the business, or they focus more of their time on their personal life, right? They've got better work-life balance. Sure. DSOs love those types of practices because you've essentially eliminated the key man risk by spreading the production among multiple providers. I think the question is, are you going to stay in that role as quote unquote CEO post-affiliation? And if so, what is your compensation going to be? And what are your responsibilities going to be, right? What are you going to offload to the DSO? And then what's your role going to be on the day-to-day in the practice? And how are you going to be compensated? And then thinking about how is your compensation post-affiliation going to impact EBITDA? And therefore, exactly. How is that going to impact the initial valuation? So if your game plan is to stay on post-affiliation and continue to provide some type of, leadership support, CEO type services to your business post-affiliation, we've got to talk about, prior to going to market, what are our expectations as far as your compensation is going to be concerned post-affiliation? How is that going to burden the EBITDA of the practice? What is that going to do to the valuation? Because it's going to erode EBITDA, it's going to erode valuation. And if we're talking about, a 7, 8, 9x multiple, for every dollar that you're going to take in CEO compensation, you're going to lose $7, $8, $9 in value. So we just need to make sure pre-market that we have those discussions, understand what your role is today, what your role is going to be post-affiliation, and how you're going to be compensated and how that's ultimately going to impact the deal terms.
This episode is being brought to you by our friends over at Nexa Healthcare, the leading answering service for dental offices across the United States. Imagine the value that you could add to your practice by being able to stay connected with your patients and even potential patients 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Well, that's exactly what Nexa will help you do with their round-the-clock answering and scheduling support. Callers will speak with a live person within 3 rings, whether day, night, or even weekends and holidays. In the cases of emergencies, the calls are escalated quickly so your patients aren't kept waiting. If you want to stop missing calls and give your patients the customer service they deserve, go to Nexa, that's Nexa.com, and use the code DPP for specialized Dentalpreneur pricing. Nexa.com, code DPP. So I love this. I love this conversation. Such a high level conversation, Brannon. So if you decide that, hey, listen, I have $1 million in EBITDA. I don't want to get paid, $200,000 a year as the CEO of this company. I would rather roll that into, the company and increase EBITDA by $200,000. Do you get full credit for that 200,000? Say it's a 7X. Do you get that like an additional $1.4 million in the valuation? Because that DSO would potentially have to replace you if you were doing some admin tasks. Or would they come up with some, variable that they would put in there if you were taking zero salary?
I think your last comment is key. It depends if the DSO has the capability to fully take on the responsibilities that you're responsible for on a daily basis.
Okay.
If the answer is yes, if they don't need you to continue to play that role in the business, then you'll get full credit for your CEO comp on the EBITDA and on the valuation. But if you are fulfilling a role that the DSO can't fulfill, and they would have to potentially replace you should you step out of the business, then it's going to be a much, harder argument to get you full credit for your compensation. So I think that's what it really comes down to. It's no different than, chairside doctor comp, right? If you're willing to do dentistry for free post-affiliation because you don't want to burden the EBITDA of the practice with your chairside wage, and you want that money to be credited towards your EBITDA and therefore credited towards your valuation, a DSO is going to say, well, hold on, time out. Just because you're willing to do dentistry for free doesn't mean that an associate would be willing to do dentistry for free. So you're eventually going to step out of this business, and we're eventually going to have to burden the cash flow with the doctor comp that we're going to have to pay somebody to do this dentistry. It's the same type of conversation. I think the most important thing, though, is controlling the narrative, right? Identifying what your responsibilities are to the business outside of your chairside production, and how are we going to frame that when we go to market? Are we going to be asking for credit for your CEO compensation and therefore boost the EBITDA, boost the valuation? Or do you really want to stay on and continue to provide those services and continue to earn, compensation for that role And, how is that going to burn the EBITDA? What is that going to do to the valuation? So it's really important that we have these type of conversations with our clients before we go to market, so we can pregame, pre-plan, control the narrative, and then, make sure that we're seeing eye to eye with the DSO buyers as we're negotiating deal terms.
Right. Okay. This is great. So Brannon, if you were, say, counseling a youngish doc, maybe mid-career doc, they're in their mid to late 30s. They have a very successful, vibrant practice, but they listen to podcasts, and they have a couple friends that are brokers, or maybe they've gone to a barbecue with you and your brother, and they've heard about this consolidation wave coming, and that for certain, private equity companies and DSOs, the multiples are high right now. Although, 25% of the existing DSOs are sitting on the sidelines. What would you counsel this person to do if they're getting a barrage of offers? I don't know, let's say 6 to 7 times their EBITDA, and their EBITDA is, approaching 7 figures. Would you feel comfortable saying, hey, a bird in the hand is better than taking a risk at what may happen 5, 7, 10 years down the line, because consolidation may take over, which is going to dilute the value of your practice if there's, too many buyers, out there. What is your take on this little slice in time? Do you think it's the right thing to do to sell at a young age with a lot of runway left? Or would you take a risk and say, I'm going to hold out for growth and similar EBITDA multiples in the future?
I think, nobody's got a crystal ball, right? And it's a very, very personal decision. Obviously, the decision to go the DSO private equity route, it becomes more complicated the longer your runway, right? So if you're 50, 55, 60 years old, if you've got, 5 to 7 years of runway left before exiting the business, whether it be retirement, relocation, whatever it may be, it's pretty damn compelling to look at the DSO private equity option at the moment. But as you start to, extend the runway, as you start to talk about, 35, 40-year-old doctors, it's a much more dynamic conversation. The longer the runway, the less compelling, and to some degree, this conversation can be. So you've got to decide, first of all, what's my why? What are you trying to accomplish, right? If you were going to go down the DSO route, what is the compelling reason that you're looking to do it? Is it because you want to take a step back and you want help from an administrative perspective? Is it because you want to utilize somebody else's infrastructure and capital to take a step forward and continue to scale your business? Those are two very different whys, but a DSO could be in the position to help you accomplish either one of those. You've got to quantify the economics, right? What would this look like if I own it for another 10 to 15 years on my own, and then sold it maybe even to a private buyer at a more traditional valuation comparative to a DSO or private equity buyer? So we help our clients kind of map out, one, identify their why, really clearly define it, and then map out, what does this look like from a 5-year, 10-year, 15-year perspective? If you go down the DSO private equity route, we can make some assumptions, factor in the cash at close, factor in a second bite of the apple, maybe even a third bite of the apple, versus continue to own the business on your own and then maybe sell it down the road in a more traditional sense, so that we can compare apples to apples economically, but also talk about, the risk reward. I think first and foremost, there's no need to panic. Have we been in an incredible window of opportunity where, we're arguably the hottest vertical from a private equity perspective, and there's, hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars pouring into our industry, and practices are trading for, really an all-time high from a multiple EBITDA perspective? Absolutely. So it makes sense, if you are a large practice owner, if you've got $2 million in top line revenue or more, you should be looking at the option. You should at least consider it. But you don't need to sell because of FOMO, and you don't need to panic, in the sense that I don't think private practice is completely under attack. I think private practice will continue to exist and potentially thrive long term. Now, you've got to evolve. You've got to be more dynamic from a business perspective. You've got to be more intentional. The trend towards group practice is not going to go away. So if you're going to be successful long-term as a private practice owner, you need to learn how to play the same game that the DSOs do, right? How to leverage economies of scale. You're going to need multiple providers and maybe multi-specialty under the same roof. You're going to need to learn how to control overhead. You're going to need to learn how to consistently invest in capital equipment and technology and afford to do so. So you're going to have to kind of, play the same game that DSOs are playing to some degree to be successful long term. But I don't think that there's a massive risk that private practice is going to go the direction in dental that medical has gone and get fully consolidated, where these practices don't have any value in 10 to 15 years.
Sure. Oh man, that's the best answer to that question I think I've ever gotten. Because you are around these deals all the time, I'm sure you see different private equity companies / DSOs have different formulas for valuation, subtly different formulas for valuation. But what have you seen as far as private equity or DSOs or private equity backed DSOs? What kind of tricks do they play when it comes to valuation to make the seller feel better about saying yes to a deal? For instance, there's a couple different variables that I know that they can levers they can push or pull. They can manipulate your EBITDA. They can manipulate the multiples. They can manipulate the terms as far as, the amount of equity that you have to roll back into the organization. So what are some of the things that you see commonplace as far as manipulations?
I love this question. This is probably my favorite question to answer. Look, DSOs, private equity are predatory in some sense, right? The name of the game on their side of the table is to buy low and sell high.
Right.
And I don't say that to say that they're, bad players, right? Or bad people. If we were in their position, we'd do the same damn thing. So first and foremost, their goal is to do a deal in the dark. Essentially for you not to have proper representation, to not create optionality, to not create leverage. They would prefer that you respond to a solicitation and accept an unsolicited offer, and therefore essentially don't hold their feet to the fire by fielding, multiple bids and leveraging that competition to drive a better economic outcome. So they prefer that you don't have somebody like me at the table to properly represent you. So that's, I'd say, the number one way that they take advantage of dentists is they've created huge business development teams, marketing machines. They're paying their doctor partners to refer their colleagues. They're doing whatever they can to get a hold of what they'll call a proprietary deal, proprietary lead that's not being touched by advisors like me or other, potential suitors. So that's number one. Number two is manipulating EBITDA. Oftentimes people speak about EBITDA multiples, like that's the main driver from a valuation perspective. It's actually not. EBITDA is the main driver, not the EBITDA multiple. So what DSOs will sometimes do is manipulate the narrative regarding EBITDA, try to convince you that your EBITDA is significantly lower than it is, but dangle the carrot of a big multiple, right? So they'll tell you, hey, I'm going to give you, 8 times EBITDA. That's nobody else is offering those types of multiples on your practice that has, 400,000 in EBITDA. So 8 times 400,000 is a $3.2 million valuation. However, your EBITDA is actually 600,000, but they're not giving you credit for certain add backs, or they're layering in some type of infrastructural cost. So if your EBITDA is actually 600,000 and the valuation is 3.2 million, they're only offering you like a 5.5 multiple. So those are the games that they play. It's easier to manipulate the EBITDA and save a lot of money from a valuation perspective than manipulating the multiple itself. So many people are focused on the multiple. I always say a multiple of what? A big part of what we do is control the narrative regarding EBITDA. And then the third thing is manipulating deal structure. Right now, because the capital markets are tight, DSOs are trying to make their dollars go further. They're trying to make their borrowed funds go further. They're trying to make their equity go further. The way to do so is to drive down cash at closing. So, a lot of DSOs are offering or attempting to offer, lower cash at close than they did over the past couple of years, 40, 50, 60% cash at close, where comparatively speaking, a couple of years ago, they were more at 70 to 80% cash at close. Mm-hmm. And then manipulating deal structure, particularly when it comes to the joint venture structure. So we've seen a lot of games being played in a joint venture deal, and I'll kind of explain what that structure means. So in a joint venture deal, you're selling, let's say, 60 to 70% of your business, and then you're retaining equity at the practice level, 30 to 40% equity at the practice level. In a true joint venture structure, you should receive your ongoing prorated portion of EBITDA, right? If I retain 30% of my business, I should receive 30% of the EBITDA ongoing post-affiliation. Now, anytime you're talking about a joint venture structure, there's going to be some sort of management fee involved that the DSO is going to charge the practice. So they're going to burden the P&L of the practice with a management fee. That fee is being paid for the services, the centralized services the DSO is providing to your office, whether that be marketing, accounting, bookkeeping, legal, compliance, HR, whatever those services may look like. Now, manipulating that fee can obviously manipulate your pro rata share of EBITDA distributions. So controlling that fee to some regard is key, right? We see those fees range from anywhere from 5% of revenue all the way to 25% of EBITDA. So we try to cap those fees or negotiate those fees if we can. We're also seeing DSOs lever the practices with the debt that they're borrowing to get the deal done, which is wild. Okay. Yeah. So if they're borrowing, $3 million to do, your transaction to give you $3 million cash at close, they're then levering at the practice level. They're placing that debt on the P&L of the practice. So those debt payments are going to be taken out of your pro rata share of EBITDA, which is really going to dilute your return. And in some cases, they're actually asking the doctors to personally guarantee the debt. In some cases, we're seeing that they're actually levering the practice with more debt than the cash at close that they're paying you. I mean, if they're levering the practice with debt, and in particular, if they're levering the practice with more debt than the cash at close that they're giving you, affiliating with a DSO is kind of commiserate to like a refi cash out loan on your house. It's like a home equity loan. That's not an actual sale. So you need to pay attention to the levers these DSOs are pulling from a management fee perspective. Are they levering the practice with debt? If so, how much debt? And are you being asked to personally guarantee that debt? There's also deal terms on the front end that will impact your exit at recap. So you want to know, what are your rights going to be at recap? Can you exit your equity in part or in full? Is there a ceiling on the multiple that you're going to receive comparative to the multiple that the DSO receives? We've seen that, where a DSO will say, at recap, you have a ceiling of 10 times EBITDA, whereas we might trade for 15 times EBITDA, but your ceiling on your proceeds at recap are limited to 10 times EBITDA. So you need to look at, what is your initial valuation? Is it fair? Are you getting credit for the full EBITDA? What's your real effective EBITDA multiple? What's the cash at close component? And then if you're in a joint venture structure, how are your EBITDA distributions being impacted by the management fee, by levering the practice with debt? And then also looking at, how are the terms that you're agreeing to on the front end of the deal going to impact the second bite of the apple, right? How are they going to impact your ability to liquidate your equity and your rights at recap? How much equity can you liquidate? Is there a ceiling on the multiple? Is your EBITDA being taxed by the management fee at recap? Or are you receiving full credit for your EBITDA without it being reduced by the management fee at recap? There are so many ifs and details that we need to unpack when we're talking about LOIs and when we're talking about legal agreements as we navigate this process. So making sure that you fully understand what you're getting yourself into and you're doing it eyes wide open and there are no surprises post-affiliation or at recap is critical.
And that wraps it up for part 1 of this 2-part episode with Brannon Moncrief. Make sure you guys tune in tomorrow for the conclusion. Have a great day. This episode is being brought to you by our great friends over at Profi 2020. Profi is a full-service dental CPA firm that provides bookkeeping services, monthly financial reports, managerial accounting services, and proactive tax service to growth-oriented dentists around the country. Profi was born in a dental practice out of their owner's frustrations with the dental accounting industry. Chris Sands actually managed a dental practice early in his career, learning the business from the ground up. During that time, he found that it was nearly impossible to get thorough financial reporting for the practice and even more difficult to get any kind of proactive guidance. That's when he and his business partner, CPA Brent Sonnier, decided to fix it for themselves. Profi 2020 is proactive in a notoriously reactive industry. Most accounting firms, especially in dentistry, deal only with the past. Profi provides detailed reporting, growth-oriented advice, and dental-specific strategies to their clients to ensure that they are positioned for healthy long-term growth. On a personal note, I can definitely endorse Profi as my CPA firm of choice. And the 2 years that I've been with them have been the best in regards to organization and implementing advanced strategies to decrease my tax liability. If you'd like to get started or learn more, schedule your free financial x-ray and get half off the onboarding cost for being a listener of the Dentalpreneur Podcast. Just go to Profi, Profi 2020.com/DSI. That's Profi2020.com/DSI. And that wraps it up for another episode of the Dentalpreneur Podcast. Look forward to reconnecting on the next episode.
Thank you so much for joining us today on the Dentalpreneur Podcast. Check out TrueDentalSuccess.com for full recaps of every show, a schedule of our live events, free video tutorials, and a whole host of practice building resources.